Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of QUT Business School, we are thrilled to welcome you to today's special event with UN Women Australia. QUT Business School is proud to be UN Women Australia's exclusive Queensland and ACT education partner since 2015. Whether through the scholarships we offer, our various committees for student, staff and alumni, or in the classroom, our university is committed to embedding gender equity philosophy and practices into all aspects of the university's activities. QUT Business School's partnership with UN Women Australia provides many valuable opportunities, like today, to continue building on this commitment to encourage and promote gender equality to all members of the QUT community. A big thank you to Janelle Weissman, Executive Director of UN Women Australia, who is joining us shortly from Canberra for today's discussion on Sustainable Development Goal number 5, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Bree Hurst as our moderator today. Bree is a senior lecturer and researcher at QUT Business School's School of Advertising, Marketing and Public Relations. She is a member of QUT's Centre for Decent Work and Industry and a proud QUT Business School alumnus. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the land where QUT now stands, and from where we are hosting today's presentation. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, their laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. I acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community.
QUT acknowledges the First Nations owners of the lands on where we gather today and pay our respects to the elders, laws, customs and creation spirits of this country. For thousands of years, the First Nations owners have gathered to share their knowledge and stories. We pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and acknowledge the important role they play within our communities. We recognise their long and continuing connection to country, the lands, winds and waters throughout Australia. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, researching and learning.
Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Today we're joined by Janelle Weissman, Executive Director of UN Women Australia, for this special discussion on Sustainable Development Goal 5, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Janelle leads a team charged with amplifying UN Women's global agenda to advance women in leadership, promote economic empowerment, end all forms of discrimination and violence against women, and ensure women's voices are central to humanitarian response. You can use the Q&A function on your screen to post questions for Janelle as we move through the Q&A. I will do my best to get through as many questions as I can. I would now like to welcome Janelle Weissman. Janelle, thanks for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Bree, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Amanda, as well, for the long-standing partnership between UN Women Australia and QUT Business School. I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands where I am today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you so much for your custodianship for generations. Great to be here, Bree.
Janelle, can we start by setting the scene a little bit and talking about the 2030 agenda broadly?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's really quite different to the 2030 agenda, which is also referred to as the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short, or the Global Agenda, the 2030 agenda, is quite different to the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded them 15 years previous. The Sustainable Development Goals were really co-created through an extensive consultation process, which included governments, civil society organizations, grassroots activists, private sector, to really try to chart a course and an agenda that every country, everywhere could participate in. And the outcome is 17 goals, quite diverse goals, but quite all-encompassing goals that really require all of our participation and require all of our it require all of us to really take responsibility to achieve. And it's really about a healthier, more prosperous, and more peaceful planet for people everywhere. So different to the Millennium Development Goals, it's not really targeting on the most resource poor parts of the world in the global south and developed nations, but it's actually saying we have a responsibility all across the globe to make change around things like SDG 5, gender equality, which we'll get on to shortly, or climate change and ensuring that we have safe spaces and flourishing cities, economic participation, ending poverty. It's really all-encompassing for everybody all across the planet.
Janelle, you briefly mentioned Sustainable Development Goal 5 there, but let's talk a little bit more about that. So Sustainable Development 5 is about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. So can you tell me a little bit more about that goal specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it was incredibly exciting to be part of the UN Women family when the SDGs agenda were agreed by 193 nations, so all member states all across the globe, because it's the first time that a global agenda like this blueprint, has a standalone, so a dedicated goal, which is, as you rightly say, focused on gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. So there are a whole range of indicators and targets and metrics, because we all know what gets measured is what gets done, that underpin the achievement of gender equality around ending violence, around economic participation of women, really across a whole range of indicators. But one of the things that's also instrumental and important to bear in mind is, whilst the standalone SDG number 5 is absolutely essential, requires targeted intervention, investment, resources, participation, and focus, gender equality actually underpins the achievement of every sustainable development goal. We know that in order to achieve a safer, healthier planet, to reduce conflict, to ensure prosperity and promote economic development, that we need to ensure everyone's participation. And still today, women are not well represented in positions of leadership or equally represented in workforces, for example. And so really, SDG 5 is important that it be standalone, but the spirit of gender equality is absolutely woven in throughout all of the Sustainable Development Goals.
And so, Janelle, UN Women as an organisation is only 11 years old. Can you tell me what are some of the key achievements of the organisation during this period?
Yeah, absolutely. So UN Women was established in July of 2010, and it was at the recognition, really as a result of the recognition that the United Nations really did require a dedicated standalone entity that was focused on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And historically, it actually was created as a result of the amalgamation of 4 different parts of the UN system, including UNIFEM, the UN Development Fund for Women. But since it was established, so almost 11 years ago now, UN Women has staff in more than 90 countries. The reach of programs that work on ending all forms of violence against women, promoting women's leadership and full political participation, ensuring women's economic participation and economic empowerment, ensuring women have a voice in peace, humanitarian, and security processes. All of those focus areas of UN Women have resulted in programs almost quadrupling in the last 11 years, which is really quite extraordinary. And that's a result of the way that UN Women works. UN Women absolutely works, I like to say, from the grassroots to the grass top. So it's with grassroots activists who are agents of change, women's human rights defenders who are working at the coalface to ensure equal rights and opportunities for women and girls, through to the highest levels of governments to ensure that policies are changed. And just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of the last 11 years, UN Women has increased policies to enable economic inclusion of women so that now more than 2 billion women are able to fully participate in the economy since the establishment of UN Women. More than 1.5 billion women and girls experience enhanced legal protections to ensure safety from violence, but also to improve accessibility and the quality of services to support survivors, victim survivors of violence. UN Women, since its establishment of the He for She Solidarity Initiative back in 2014, on the floor of the UN General Assembly, championed by Emma Watson, a UN Women Global Goodwill Ambassador, really calling on men to stand alongside women and non-binary people to say that we all need to be champions for a gender equal world. We all need to work together to achieve a world where all of us are free and equal. And since the He for She initiative was launched, we now have tens of millions of men and allies who are champions for gender equality, really standing alongside women's activists and advocates on whose shoulders I certainly stand for generations of work that has come before me. And more than 25 countries have reformed their constitutions in support of women's full political participation. That's everything from voting rights to initiatives that really support the flourishing participation of women standing for election.
Janelle, it's really impressive to hear what UN Women has been able to achieve in the past few years. And you mentioned the He for She campaign, and if we can, I wouldn't mind talking about the UN Women Australia's recent ad campaign, which is called When Will She Be Right? And if we can play the video, that would be fantastic.
Here in Australia, we're pretty easygoing. We don't like to get caught up in things. If something goes wrong, we just say, she'll be right. If we lose a ball over the back fence, she'll be right. The car's parked it in the middle of the bush, she'll be right. She's still being paid 87 cents to the dollar, she'll be right. She can't walk home alone at night for fear of being raped, she'll be right. You see, for a country that's ranked 44th on the Global Gender Gap Index, she's just not that big of a priority. I mean, she's only boss 18% of the time. She'll be right. She has a 1 in 3 chance of being assaulted. She'll be right. She could even be the one woman a week killed by a man she knew and trusted. But yeah, she'll be right. When will she be right? Dunno. You see, Aussies don't usually talk about when. She will be. Eventually. Right?
Janelle, that's a pretty confronting campaign and a really powerful message. Can you tell me a little bit more about it and what UN Women Australia is doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Brie. And I also just want to flag as well that we have this video on YouTube and on our website, but we do have a trigger warning. And I recognize that there are issues, quite stark issues around violence against women that are discussed in that video. And I just want to emphasize that anybody who needs support, there is support available through our 24/7 Australian National Hotline for domestic and family violence and survivors of sexual assault. And that's 1-800-RESPECT. And that's 1-800-737-732. 1-800-respect.org.au is also a website you can access for resources and support. I just feel like it's incredibly important that we make that really, really clear and want to support anybody who may need it. So look, the genesis of the campaign was really for us about trying to flip the script a bit. We recognize there's that long held phrase, she'll be right, which assumes that everything will sort itself out in time. But what we know is that's not the case. We know that through the statistics that are very starkly shared throughout the course of that very brief film. And it's really, when we look at behavior change campaigns, which is effectively what gender equality is all about, it's about really combating discrimination, sexism, transforming gender norms, and combating stereotypes so that we can create a world where everyone has equal rights and opportunities. And that first step of behavior change is education. And so we wanted to take an opportunity to use a well-loved, a well-worn phrase, but again, flip that phrase just to get people's attention, I think, more than anything. And for us, When Will She Be Right is the first step is education. The second step is about really encouraging people to have a conversation, one person, one organization at a time, to share your thoughts around the things that we all can do to be champions for gender equality and create that world that is gender equal. And really, for us, we encourage anybody like to use the film as a conversation starter in a classroom or in a workplace, obviously with the parameters around safety being really first front and center. We really encourage you to do so, but we're really wanting to shine a light on the fact that despite the fact we are a lucky country on so many measures here in Australia, we still have a long way to go.
And that's actually something really interesting, Janelle. So when we saw the end of that video, it highlighted that the gender global equality is still 100 years away. And we know that that figure was based off the World Economic Forum 2020 Global Gender Gap Report. However, the most recent report has actually shown we've gone backwards in the last year, and now it's going to take almost 136 years to close the gender gap worldwide. Can you tell me what's happened? And I think importantly, are you concerned that it's going to take us a while to claw this back?
Yes, in short, Brie, 100%. I'm deeply concerned, and I think everybody's alarm bells really should be ringing quite loudly as a result. So it was literally within weeks. So the campaign was released on the 5th of March at our International Women's Day events, which some of you may have participated in. I know QUT was well represented. And then on the 30th of March, the new World Economic Forum report was released, showing that it will take 135.6 years to achieve global gender equality. So look, at UN Women, we were some of the first to really shine a light on the impacts of COVID-19 on women and girls. And that's certainly one of the factors that has led to a whole generation loss of progress towards gender equality. At UN Women, we refer to the quadruple burden of COVID-19 on women and girls. The first part is that more women have lost more jobs and wages as a result of COVID-19. The second is that women are disproportionately represented on the front lines of COVID-19, so increased exposure to the virus itself, and that's recognizing that 70% of healthcare workers are women all across the globe. Thirdly, women have really suffered the burden of care, and UN Women Asia and the Pacific, my colleagues in Bangkok, put out a report on the first 100 days of COVID, which showed in parts of our region, the burden of care increased from what is a global average of 3 times more care work done by women than by men to 11 times the burden. It's inconceivable, and it's hard to imagine actually balancing so many things that we all juggle in our everyday lives with that sort of increased burden. And the fourth, and one of the most confronting issues for us, is recognizing the term that UN Women coined is the shadow pandemic. And that shadow pandemic that we're referring to is the shadow pandemic of violence against women. And we know all across the globe, there have been increased rates of domestic and family violence when lockdowns have been in place. We know that home is not always a safe place for women to shelter in place. And we've certainly seen the results through increased rates of violence against women and girls through lockdowns. So COVID-19 significantly impacted this rollback of progress towards the gender equality agenda. But really, it was situated in a context where we're seeing much more backlash against movements really promoting women's rights as human rights and human rights as women's rights. There are quite a lot of more totalitarian leaning regimes, conservative, far-right conservative regimes, which have meant that in some cases, women's rights have significantly rolled back in the last couple of decades, actually. And it's a bit sobering to say this, but, the celebration of the Beijing Platform for Action, which was signed by 189 countries back in 1995. It's the fourth World Conference on Women, where people gathered, member states, civil society activists gathered to really promote gender equality. And that platform for action that was signed in 1995 remains the most progressive blueprint towards achieving gender equality. And in 2020, looking back on what had been achieved, sadly, in many cases, rights have rolled back. So we definitely have our work cut out for us, but that's why we do the work that we do, and we're so humbled by partnership with QUT Business School and by all the people who've chosen to tune in today and participate in everyday actions that you all can take to advance gender equality in the spheres in which we operate and influence.
Janelle, there's a bit to unpack there, and the shadow pandemic is something that I would like to come back to. And I'd just like to remind everyone at home that you can use the Q&A function to post questions as Janelle and I chat today. But Janelle, my next question for you is, what's Australia getting right? Where do we need to improve? What can be done?
Sure. So it's really interesting. So with the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, there are always country by country rankings. And in the report that was released on the 30th of March, one of the things that has remained is that Australia still remains ranked number 1 in educational attainment for women. This is across primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And we know that on average, more women receive tertiary education here in Australia than do men. So it's quite extraordinary. We have really significant participation on the education front. The counterpart to that is that workforce participation has rolled back. And so we do not have even an equal representation of women in the workforce. We have some work to do there. Some other things that we're doing quite well is through long-standing really movements. It's a combination of pressure from unions as well as mobilizing change within the private sector. Australia actually has some of the most world-leading policies around acknowledging that domestic and family violence is an issue that is to be addressed at the workplace. And it's recognizing that we need to ensure that we have safe spaces, that we have an opportunity, recognizing that somebody may disclose for the very first time that they're experiencing violence at home in a workplace, that we have HR teams who are trained, we have policies in place to support domestic and family violence leave for people who need it. Literally, Australia is one of the models across the world in recognizing domestic and family violence as a workplace issue. And we've actually seen employers with a policy on strategy on domestic violence increasing in the past year by over 6%. So there are now 66.4% of employers across Australia that have a policy and a strategy in place. It's really quite extraordinary. We're also seeing some really important developments, and this does not come as a surprise for any of us who are tuning in from wherever we're working today or studying or doing whatever it is that we do during our daytime today on a Tuesday, which is flexible work. So flexible work, we've seen some really important increases in recognition that it's abundantly possible that all roles and many roles can be flexibly worked. And we've seen employers with a policy for flexible work increase by 3.2% in the last year. So that's up to 75.9%. Women's representation on ASX 200 boards is on the rise, albeit a bit slow. We are seeing some improvements. So we've seen the proportion of women on ASX 200 boards increase by 2% in the last year. 113 of 200 companies on the ASX 200 listing reached the 30% threshold, and another 76 of those 87 that are lagging behind are actually one appointment away from that 30% threshold. Now, 30% is fantastic. It's a really important target and a marker. We would like to really press for parity, so 50-50 representation. Now, things that we can do better. Look, I mean, there are obviously measures that have been recently introduced, which are promising practice to see some gains in terms of affordability, accessibility of childcare. We certainly saw some important initiatives supported by government during COVID as well in that regard. But there's still more to do when it comes to increasing accessibility and affordability, particularly of early childhood education. We recognize how very important that is to enable all people who want to work to be able to work, and particularly so long as we tend to hold a norm that there are more, in practice, there are more women who are primary carers of children, that accessible and quality childcare will have a significant influence on women's participation in the workforce, but equally enables all people to participate. I'd also really like to see some important changes when it comes to paid parental leave. We have some really sensational examples of Nordic countries where we have incentives whereby both parents, whether that's a heterosexual, same-sex household, the two carers, that if they share the care of their children, that there are incentives in place to enable them to do that. We'd really like to see more dads in particular actively participating and really provide some incentives to enable them to do so. And a part of that is really making sure that we have, people who lead loudly. So we have, still today, as we know from the film, the majority of bosses still today in corporate Australia are men, that they are actively participating in the caring of their children and leaving loudly. So if you're leaving at 3 o'clock for school pickup, or to see your son's dance recital, or to see your daughter play in a footy match, that we're being really visible and loud about that. But certainly we recognize violence against women is still a scourge. It's something we have far too many examples of every single day here in our country and all across the world. But we have some really world-leading models as well. Incredible primary prevention frameworks led by Our Watch and ANROS. We have the Respect at Work report, which was led by our illustrious sex discrimination commissioner, the terrific Kate Jenkins and her team. And I really urge us all to look at how, and certainly within government, that's across all levels of government, making sure that we fully implement those recommendations, because we know that more than 50% of women have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace at some point. We know that men experience harassment as well. We need to end sexual harassment in all of its forms, but whether that's in the workplace or in public places, sexual harassment, abuse, and violence against women, we've still got really a fair way to go. So look, there's some positives in there, Brie, things to celebrate, things to build on, but also we do have some work to do.
I think that's really interesting that, we do need to acknowledge the successes that we have, but also be cognizant of what still needs to be done. And that ties really nicely into my next question, which, when we looked at the video, the last statement on that video said that gender equality can happen in 10 years. And so my question to you, Janelle, is, one, can we achieve it in the next 10 years? But importantly, what can we do in the next 10 years to try to lower the gender gap?
Yeah, so look, I am always an optimist, and I believe that change happens one person at a time, but it also happens as a result of collective movements. And I've certainly been heartened by the incredibly vocal young people really across the life course, intersectional feminist activists who are standing up for racial justice, as well as gender justice, as well as justice for trans, intersex, gender diverse people. And there's a lot that we can do in 10 years, and it starts with us. But I think the first thing I would like to encourage is we really do need to look at sharing of care. There's no question that will have an enormous impact on the ability for all of us to participate fully in the workforce. We all need to be vocal advocates for equality by stamping out sexism. And it's incredibly important that we are brave and we take bold steps and we back one another. We find ourselves in social situations, whether we're at the pub or we're at a footy match or we're in boardrooms, where we might hear comments that make us cringe or make us uncomfortable. And we absolutely need to take responsibility and stand up and speak out against sexism, against things that are inappropriate. We have a real opportunity to look at an evidence base around relationships and sexuality education in schools, looking at talking about what is okay and what is not okay very early on. So early on in children's development, which really starts planting seeds around consent and respect, because fundamentally we know that respect is the cornerstone of gender equality. It's also the cornerstone. Respect plus gender equality will help us reduce rates of violence against women here in Australia. I did mention I'd really like to see improvements in paid parental leave, and just want to encourage all of us. Our elected representatives are elected because we participate. We obviously have compulsory voting here in Australia, so we don't have it. It's an important responsibility as citizens in Australia, and I am a citizen here as well, to participate, but also to hold our elected representatives to account and celebrate when they have good policies in place and we see good initiatives that are underway, but also really press for progress and enhancements in paid parental leave, some of the increases in supporting domestic and family violence services. are absolutely to be acknowledged and celebrated. And there's still some room to go in that regard. But fundamentally, we all have a responsibility in all of the environments in which we operate to share the care, to stamp out sexism and harassment when we see it, and really to be champions and lead loudly and role model the behavior that we'd like to see in others, to ensure that we can really combat stereotypes and bias that have led to discrimination for centuries old.
Janelle, you mentioned consent there, and I think that's a really topical of late when we've seen the Teach Us Consent campaign this year, which has seen over 40,000 people sign a petition calling for consent education to be included earlier in the school curriculum. Can you tell me, what does evidence tell us about this, and what can we do in this space?
So there's no question that it's about early age-appropriate conversations. And it's really about making sure that parents and schools and all of the different sort of locations and sites that reach children and young people, including, importantly, faith communities, that we really embrace messages of consent and respect. And we know that primary prevention of violence against women and ensuring that people know the importance of consent, it really does come down to ensuring that early age and stage appropriate conversation. And it's as simple as, private, talking about what is private with, young toddlers, about it is not okay to touch your private parts, and to use anatomically correct language when we talk to children so that they're able to articulate what has happened to them if they do experience something that is inappropriate. And that really sows seeds for children throughout primary school, throughout secondary school, throughout high school, and into tertiary education, around really being equipped with language, but also equipping all children and young people, irrespective of their gender, about the importance of respect and consent. And we do have, a national curriculum. We have opportunities to strengthen that national curriculum and ensure that relationships and sexuality education is really core and central. And I absolutely, applaud some enormously successful and important evidence-based work that is being done by a whole range of NGOs all across Australia. Let's really embed and equip our teachers, our parents, and carers with the language and the tools to be able to have conversations around respect and consent from those early years, to ensure that we can really stamp out sexual abuse and sexual assault. I know that's something that is incredibly high priority on UN Women's global agenda. Still, violence against women is pervasive all across the world. We've got so much work to do, but we really do need to stop it at the start, and we really do need to make sure that we have those conversations and provide important education materials, lessons, resources to parents, carers, faith communities, sports coaches, teachers, all of those people who have an influence on young people early on.
Janelle, we've spoken a little bit about domestic violence, and the research around it is quite confronting. So we know in Australia that domestic violence kills one Australian woman every week. Can you tell us what are some of the best practices we should draw on to reduce or prevent domestic violence?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, we know that violence against women is rooted in gender inequality. So all of the things that I've talked about that are really about advancing gender equality really relate to us trying to stop violence at the start. We need to ensure respect. We need to combat casual and not casual sexism, because still too often today we hear sexist remarks. I'm ever shocked at what I might see in advertising or from a commentator, a journalist on media. And we need to be writing our media outlets. We need to be calling people to account and making sure that we demand and expect respectful language, respectful coverage of women, and really lifting up gender equal stories in the media. We absolutely need to work towards a social and cultural shift, and that does take time. A part of that is really about meeting people where they are, and I referenced in terms of consent education and early sort of relationships and sexuality education. We know at UN Women in our region and across the globe, there are parts of the population that really have important levers and influence on belief systems, and that can absolutely shape norms and people's expectations and beliefs around what is and is not okay. And at UN Women, one of the really important leading measures around violence prevention is recognizing those centers of power, influence, and those levers of change. So that's working with faith leaders. So recognizing that faith leaders have an opportunity and, in my humble opinion, an obligation to talk about respect and to talk about the importance of equality in the household, shared decision-making, equal participation in education, in the workforce, in leadership roles. We also need to use sports, and these are all things that we're doing in fits and starts in Australia. So we have some good practice, but using sporting clubs, recognizing the influence that sporting clubs have in terms of interaction with a whole range of people, really across the life course, from littlies through the life course, people participate in sports, but working with coaches and with people who are working in sporting organizations to have a no tolerance approach to violence. And we know that when we see sporting figures who have perpetrated violence, some of these people are almost, demagogues, they're role models for a lot of young people. We need to make sure that we stand out really loudly and clearly that that is not okay. And we need to have more figures in faith communities in sports, in all sorts of whoever our role models are in society, which can include the likes of Emma Watson or Kate Blanchett, or different role models that we have for different reasons, that they're really quite vocal advocates in talking about the importance of laying a foundation for gender equality. Everybody has equal rights and opportunities. It's about assuring, irrespective of your gender, that everyone can be a leader, can have access to learning opportunities, can have access to earning opportunities, and importantly, live a life free from violence and discrimination. And fundamentally, that really starts with being champions for gender equality and being very vocal about what is not okay, and making sure that we hold one another to account, even those people who may have been in positions as demagogues, as I said, whether it's sports figures or others, celebrities, others who we've seen perpetrate violence. That we need to be very clear that people need to be held responsible and accountable for their actions.
Janelle, we might just remind everyone of the number as well, 1-800-RESPECT, if you are experiencing domestic violence and you do need to reach out for some support. Can we go now to some of the questions from the audience? So the first question that we have, Janelle, is what do you think of gender quotas? Do you think they have a role to play in achieving gender equality?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. So we have quite a strong evidence base that shows that whether you call them quotas or temporary special measures, oftentimes that's what they're called in the context of parliaments, really trying to move as a lever of change to rebalance representation of women in parliaments. Oftentimes they're called temporary special measures. But we have a really strong evidence base to lean on. And it's incredibly important what gets measured, what gets done. If we're not measuring it, it can remain invisible. And quotas have been proven incredibly effective, increased numbers of women represented in leadership roles in all facets of social, economic, and political life. So it's a really important measure, one that I absolutely encourage people to look into, to better understand, and to put into practice.
Thank you. My next question comes from Craig. So Craig's question, modern slavery is a complex issue. How does this affect and link to Sustainable Development Goal 5?
So fortunately, we have seen a really important movement, and it's about public and private partnerships to end modern slavery. We obviously have the Modern Slavery Act now in Australia in the last couple of years, which is really a very important step in the right direction to ensure that we're recognizing that still today there are women who are in situations of forced labor, trafficking, and modern slavery. As private sector organizations and even as consumers, we need to recognize the supply chain and the impacts that supply chain may have if there are people who are not in a safe labor practice, that they're in forced labor, or they may have been forced or are experiencing unfair wages. There are a whole range of ways that we see modern slavery in practice. So in short, SDG number 5, gender equality and women's empowerment, absolutely does intersect with modern slavery, because we recognize that modern slavery disproportionately impacts women. The vast majority of women who are trafficked, people in forced labor, we have really strong, sadly, representation of women and children who are in forced labor. And so there's no question that if we work towards the achievement of SDG 5, that a part of that is about ending modern slavery as we know it, and making sure that if women are participating in the workforce, that it is safe, fair, voluntary, and that there's really ethical practice. So it's a really good question. There's quite a lot of detail around what private sector as well as governments are doing to end modern slavery. So thanks for your question.
I might just add to that as well, Janelle, can you talk a little bit about how SDG 5 connects with some of the other Sustainable Development Goals? I know we mentioned it at the start, but are there any that you'd like to explore a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, with 17 goals, we recognize that there's a lot of work to do. I have my cheat sheet in front of me. I won't lie. 17 is a lot to remember. So I've got my cheat sheet. So some of the things that we look at, for example, are zero hunger. So if we want to ensure that we can end hunger as we know it, we need to make sure that women have access to resources, to sustainable growing practices, that women farmers have access to productive resources, tools, seeds to contribute to ending hunger. That's an example. So making sure that when women are participating in agricultural chain of activity, that they have access to productive resources, and that includes access to land rights and ownership. And there's still places in the world where land, for example, is passed on through patrilineal lines, so from men to other men in families, as opposed to passing them on to women. That's one example. Another example is around clean water and sanitation. We know that oftentimes the burden of fetching water does fall to women in many parts of the world. And we also know that it is incredibly important that we have clean water and sanitation to ensure the elimination of illness. Oftentimes, women, there's an intersection here. We talk about quality education, and we know that when women are educated, they're more likely to experience fewer lower infant mortality. You have less maternal deaths. The women are more likely to have healthy children overall. And so that access to clean water and quality education, there are so many intersections across all of the SDGs. We think about the climate crisis and affordable and clean energy, and some of the initiatives that UN Women has put into place, where we're wanting to make sure that women are really front and center of the clean energy revolution, providing, for example, training where women have access to become solar engineers, so to learn how to develop solar products and renewables, so that they can bring energy, solar energy, to villages, which sometimes are actually electrifying, providing electricity to villages for the very first time, which means that children can read their school books at the end of the day, not by lamplight, but by a sustainable source of energy. That women, again, who often disproportionately across the world are taking carrying responsibilities, which often includes cooking responsibilities, that they're able to cook with clean fuel as opposed to with in enclosed spaces with firewood. There's so many different intersections across the SDGs. I certainly won't be able to point to all 17, but those are a couple of examples of the ways that we really need to make sure that we apply that gender lens when we're thinking about the achievement of a particular sustainable development goal, whether it's life below water, peace, justice, and strong institutions. We know that when women are represented in peace negotiating tables, that we build a more sustainable, more durable peace. So that parity in representation, applying that gender lens to the achievement and the activities towards achieving any of the sustainable development goals is an imperative.
Thank you for those examples, Janelle. And I think what you have definitely highlighted is that achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls is so important to all of the Sustainable Development Goals, really. My next question comes from Danica, and it says, "Thank you so much for the work that you do, Janelle. Are there any brands or businesses in Australia that you believe are doing an exceptional job in embedding SDG 5 into their core business practices to progress gender equality? And are there any pioneer initiatives that you could share with us?
Yeah, I'm really happy to. And it's a bit of a grab bag. So thanks for your question, Danica. The things that spring to mind for me, we had done some work with Horizon. So Horizon, formerly Queensland Rail, is an organization that actually put forward really quite a pioneering initiative around sharing the care. And it was about making sure that people who left the workforce, so that there is access to paid parental leave, meaning that you would have access to your wages. I believe it was either full or a very significant percentage of your wages. And that was ensuring that dads were able to fully participate in the caring of their children, as an example. I also think about organizations. I know that AECOM, engineering consultancy firm, has done some trialing around providing access to more of a school term based working schedule for any employee who wanted it. So looking at providing people with pro rata salary, but recognizing that if we're not having to eke out these little snippets of our 4 weeks, holiday that we have as sort of standard terms within workforces here in Australia, that if we can actually plan to take the summer holiday period off, we can plan to take the winter holiday off, we can plan to take time over, the Easter holidays, enabling workforce to actually work at the tempo of your school-age children so that you can be more actively engaged in children and young people's care. Those are a couple of examples. I think about Telstra and the fact that Telstra was the very first company to really pioneer all roles flex. It's something that caught like wildfire, and honestly, there's been a lot of really terrific positive peer pressure in that regard, in companies really wanting to follow suit and really ask the question, why not? So not about if, but why not? How can we actually make roles flexible? There are also some really important initiatives. Some of the financial institutions have put into place around recognizing financial abuse as a precursor and oftentimes a signal to other forms of abuse. When we talk about violence against women, it's not just a physical expression of violence against women. It can be psychological, it can be sexual, it can be financial. And I know that Westpac, for example, has recently introduced an initiative where they're actually monitoring messages where if to a family, a couple, there are some males who have been quite chronically using the messaging when you transfer funds as an opportunity to send abusive messages to their partners, whether it's former partner or a partner where they may be going through a difficult time. And so they're actually monitoring for those abusive messages, and they're blacklisting people who are using those messaging systems to abuse their partners, and blacklisting them from having bank accounts at Westpac. That's a pretty pioneering example of ways that you're using really your role as a financial institution to really monitor the behavior of people and really take that no tolerance approach to violence of any form. So those are a couple. As I said, it's a bit of a grab bag, but those are a couple of things off the top of my head. But Workplace Gender Equality Agency cites employers of choice, and both Chief Executive Women and the Coalition of Champions of Change have really terrific case study examples, and really some leading research around what are some better practices that are underway that private sector organizations of all sizes, not just the big end of town, but small, medium enterprises can really take on board to advance gender equality across what their external facing internal policies, and really across supply chain through advertising and all the different ways that commercial business impact us in our everyday lives.
Janelle, I think you raised an interesting point there around the what if, and is some of this about challenging the status quo?
Yeah, there's no question that if we remain complacent, we will never see a world where our children, our grandchildren will be able to unleash their full potential. And I want to be really clear, this is as much about equal rights and opportunities for girls as boys, as non-binary, gender diverse children. Toxic masculinity plays a role in perpetuating stereotypes around, throwing like a girl or boys don't cry, and keeping boys and men away from participating as vulnerable humans and with emotions, and we need to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to express the full gamut of emotions and really bring their full selves, whether that's to the workplace, to the family, to the sporting field, to the boardroom. We need to make sure that we're really looking at how we can unleash everybody's full potential. We have some really staggering statistics around the dearth of women participating in STEM, for example, the low number of women who have been recognized as Nobel Prize winners. We need to challenge that. There's been a long-standing movement over the last couple of years around the Australia award system, and we've definitely seen some progress there. Nominate a woman. I think one of the first sort of announcements around, so there was a lot of pushback around, we're not seeing many, and we're not seeing parity of women represented in the Australian award system. And the first response was, we as a system, I'm not involved in the system, but we're not actually receiving a lot of nominations for women. So that's on all of us, men, gender diverse people, women, to nominate more women to be acknowledged through the Australia award system. So yes, because business as usual is what we've seen, doesn't mean that it's what we should aspire to into the future. And if anything has taught us that, it's COVID in the last year. We've seen, as an example, the questions around if not, why not, when it comes to All Roles Flex, through organizations who for, decades had said we can't, and they found a way because they had to, they were forced to. And sometimes it's that sort of disruption that is necessary. I say that I'm not suggesting that it's about a global pandemic, but it's about just embracing the opportunities that all of the curveballs that come our way, to be able to disrupt the status quo and really activate, stir change.
And Janelle, that leads really nicely into my last question. And throughout our webinar today, you've spoken about, the role of an individual. So as an individual person, an individual organisation, and that as individuals, we can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly empowering women and also, working towards gender equality. So if there's I guess the question is, what can we do as an individual to try to empower women and girls and achieve gender equality?
I think the first thing for me, it comes back to being the change that you want to see in the world. So we have to really be role models in our everyday lives. That doesn't mean that I am perfect every minute of every day. Believe me, I'm not. It's about taking responsibility for when we're not. It's about calling ourselves out honestly and respectfully when we see that sexism, when we see harassment, when we see gender discrimination in action. We need to be the change that we want to see in the world and really role model what it is, the standard that we expect of others. I've talked about sharing the care. It's incredibly important. It's instrumental to ensure a gender equal world. It's a really important lever of change. We need to demand an equal work culture. And I really want to encourage, no matter who might be tuning in today, no matter your role in a conventional organizational chart, whether you're a student, whether you're a board chair of an ASX 200 listed company, all of us have an opportunity to influence. And it really starts by calling out what's right and calling out what's wrong. And when we call out what's wrong, I find it's incredibly valuable to provide some solutions. So to provide some of the evidence base around what we want to see differently. So if we've seen a recruitment panel where there were no women, or there was one woman on a panel of 5 who was on a recruitment panel for a position in our organization, let's call it out, but let's also offer solutions. So let's be really clear about what it is that we want to see. We want to see that parity. We want to see equal representation on that, simple example of a recruitment panel. I also want to encourage all of us to really focus on fixing systems and changing cultures. This isn't about fixing women. It's about chipping away at deeply held norms, eliminating toxic masculinities that hold all of us back from realizing our full potential. And especially now, I feel like it's so important for us to really embrace all of the opportunities that we have afforded to us to be leaders, whether that's running for a leadership role in a student body, in your university or school clubs, whether that's running for local council, state or territory office, or indeed federal office. Really encourage people, and again, this may feel out of reach, but I'll tell you what, I'm in regular contact with Women for Election Australia, and every one of their trainings for women interested in pursuing elected office in the last 11 months has been sold out, which is a real signal that there's a real appetite to have more equal representation. But equally, whether you wish to stand for election, as I said before, we elect our representatives. It is their responsibility and obligation to respond to what it is that we believe is important. When we see good policy, let's celebrate it. Let's write our members of parliament and senators and say thank you and appreciate those good practices, those good policies. When we see things that really haven't inched the dial enough, let's also communicate with them. So we all have an opportunity, an obligation, and a responsibility to be in communication to the leaders, whether it's in our organizations and our parliaments, but also to role model what it is that we want to see to create a more gender equal world. It takes all of us to advance gender equality and engage in a dialogue around concrete solutions. And for those, we certainly have no shortage of policy briefs at unwomen.org.au, as well as unwomen.org. Always happy to hear from you and get your feedback.
Janelle, thank you so much for your time today. We are so incredibly appreciative, and I know we'll be watching closely to see what can be done in the next 10 years to lower the gender gap globally. Thank you to everyone who has joined in for the webcast today. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bree. Thanks to QUT Business. Take care.